Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and we're going back to the future today for a discussion of price stability in an age of emergencies, revisiting the case for buffer stocks. As many of you are aware, certainly anyone tuning into or attending today's event, the inflation of and then rapid disinflation of recent years in the high-income economies presented many parallels and differences with the 70s. One of the interesting topics which has been pursued recurrently since the late 60s, 70s inflation is the idea of addressing shortages in critical industries and critical supply aspects. And one of our speakers, Isabella Weber of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst today, has made some provocative new ideas in this direction with her co-authors. Also joining us today is Maurice Obstfeld, who, as many of you know, I'll give slightly better bios for our colleagues in a moment. Among many other things, is the C. Bergsten Senior Fellow here at Peterson, and he has thought deeply about practical responses to inflation as well, particularly in the area of international cooperation and where that is relevant. And we also have joining us virtually today, Cullen Hendrix, who's a non-resident senior fellow here at Peterson, but thankfully full-time, who's been working on the political economy of international agreements on natural resources and conflict over natural resources through the years. I don't think I need to motivate this much more beyond the topic and the quality of speakers, but I will just say that this is part of the Peterson Institute's ongoing efforts to make sense of whether and how much the inflation and sharp, relatively painless disinflation we've seen over the last few years was inevitable, was the result of good policy, was sui generis as an after effect of COVID. These are important questions in macroeconomics that remain live, and our goal is to move towards pragmatic, practical solutions, not necessarily the ones that have been pursued up till now, and think through how that can best be done. I will just mention that we have a series of publications, short publications, under the editorship of Karen Dinan and David Wilcox, the support of the Smith Richardson Foundation, looking at various topics in inflation as well that are coming out on a rolling basis from the Institute. But so today we start with Isabella M. Weber, who is an associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and associate in research at the Fairbanks Center at Harvard University. She gained initial fame and recognition for her first book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, but she has since been incredibly central in both Germany and European, as well as American discussions of how to understand the inflation following the COVID disruptions and the energy supply shock from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And she will be talking to us about some of her recent research and ideas on this front. She will be followed by Maurice Obstfeld, who, as I mentioned, is the C. Bergsten Senior Fellow here at the Peterson Institute. I'm proud to say he's been affiliated with the Institute for more than 5 years now. He is the class of 1958 Professor of Economics Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Economics at the University of California at Berkeley. And he has also previously taught at Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia. He, of course, served as chief economist and economic counselor at the director of the research department and economic counselor at the IMF from 2015 to 2018. Finally, as I mentioned, joining us virtually is Cullen Hendrix, who's a senior fellow here at PIIE. He's been affiliated with the Peterson Institute since 2010 to degrees of increasing engagement. He has published in journals ranging from Nature and Nature Climate Change to the British Journal of Political Science and the Journal of Conflict Revolution, on dealing with issues of conflicts and international cooperation over natural resources. He and Marcus Noland, the director of studies here at Peterson, published the book Confronting the Curse, The Economics and Geopolitics of Natural Resource Governance. So with that, for what I hope is a fascinating and stimulating discussion of new policy options, let me first turn to Professor Weber, please.
Thank you so much, Adam, for this generous introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. And also my sincere thanks to Maurice Obstfeld and Hendrix for agreeing to comment on my little intervention here. The title of my talk is Price Stability in an Age of Emergencies, Revisiting the Case for Buffer Stocks. And the idea is to take a forward-looking perspective on the inflation experience that we have all been going through and asking the question, what are some lessons for preparedness? If we assume that there will be more shocks to come, what is it that we should be doing in order to prevent new inflationary spirals looking forward? Next slide, okay. To put this in perspective, I just want to very quickly revisit what I have been calling seller's inflation, and I've been arguing that there are basically three stages. The first stage is the impulse stage, at which prices in critical upstream sectors spike. These price spikes present themselves as cost shocks to companies across the corporate sector, and these cost shocks in turn coordinate price hikes, which leads to a propagation of this initial impulse across the economy. Eventually, wages catch up, which can be thought of as a conflict stage of inflation. Okay. If we move from the stages of inflation to the question of what can be done about inflation, I would argue that the best thing is to keep the genie in the bottle, and that this does not even depend on the propagation and conflict stage. So it doesn't even depend on agreeing with me on whether seller's inflation is a thing or not, but it simply depends on whether one thinks that energy and food price shocks and basically upstream price shocks in the commodity sector have played some important role in the inflationary process. If this is the case, I think one has a good case to revisit the role of buffer stocks. But buffer stocks in themselves are, of course, not the only instrument that we need to move towards greater stability or less volatility in commodity markets. Other measures that come to mind are greater regulation, transparency, and transparency of commodity trading. If you are with me on seller's inflation, then I would argue that there are additional layers of policy measures that can be taken to rely less on interest rate hikes. So I would say that interest rate hikes come in at a fairly late stage of this inflationary dynamic, and there are things that can be done to contain the propagation of cost shocks across the economy, such as price gouging legislation and also antitrust enforcement. Let me revisit the classic case for buffer stocks as it has been put forward by, for example, Keynes, but also Benjamin Graham, who was the mentor of Warren Buffett, and who in fact argued for buffer stocks inspired on the long-standing tradition in China, the so-called ever-normal granaries. And I might add a footnote here and say that I believe that today, China has probably the most sophisticated buffer stock system for critical commodities that has ever existed on planet Earth. But the point that I really want to make here is to say that for Keynes and others, the idea of buffer stocks was a third way between protectionism and free trade, or control and laissez-faire. So in fact, as Keynes himself wrote, I can only plead guilty of aiming at a plan which doesn't take a middle course between unfettered competition under laissez-faire conditions and planned controls which try to freeze commerce into a fixed mold. And in fact, I think with the return of protectionism, this attempt of creating a middle ground is one that should be seriously considered at the present juncture. So the idea here is that there can be a state market participation where basically the state participates in commercial transactions on markets as a player on the market that, however, follows a different logic than the private market participants. In the interwar period and also after the Second World War, this was seen as an economic policy to preserve peace. Interestingly, both Hayek and Keynes actually agreed that the post-war order would need buffer stocks. So even if you lean more to the laissez-faire side of things, there can still be a strong case be argued in favor of international buffer stocks. I think that there are three key components that justify why buffer stocks can be a useful policy instrument. The first is that there can be threats of shortages in essentials. So this is distinguishing between essentials and non-essentials, saying that some goods are essential for human livelihoods and production, so that if there's a threat of shortages and sharp price rises in these essentials, this can have implications for macro outcomes such as inflation, exchange rate, and balance of payment issues. Buffer stocks then aim to contain such threats of shortages and stabilize prices through counter-cyclical open market operations, not unlike what central banks do in the market for money. The second point of the classic case for buffer stocks is to say that there is an inherent instability in commodity markets. This can be justified in two ways. The first way is the classic cobweb dynamic, where basically there's a slow adjustment of supply to demand, which can result in oscillations around an equilibrium without ever converging to the equilibrium. But even if you have a convergent dynamic, if there are in addition supply shocks such as bad weather, this can result in an oscillation where you never actually get to equilibrium. And this is to say that you can have a non-equilibrium kind of dynamic without even assuming any market imperfections. In principle, of course, private storage could solve the problem of slow adjustment, but as Keynes argues, the productive enterprises engaged in markets that use such commodities tend to store, have insufficient incentive to hold sufficient inventories. This is the first point. The second point is that traders and speculators tend to have pro-cyclical expectations and show herd behavior, or what is more commonly known as animal spirits. And in fact, from this second point of reasoning why private storage tends to not overcome cobweb dynamics also originates another reason why commodity markets can be inherently unstable, where basically the price fluctuation can also occur from speculative market participation without even an actual cobweb dynamic in the strict sense. In a paper that we put out recently on the energy crisis in Europe, we have been revisiting these arguments, and we have been arguing that, in fact, in the context of the European gas market, there has been a good component of animal spirits, and that if one assumes sunspots in a general equilibrium setting, then this can actually also result in a situation where free market price signals are not rational scarcity indicators. The third point is that macroeconomic stability can originate from these microeconomic fluctuations that occur in such commodity markets. Here, the logic is basically a two-sector model, where the idea is that primary commodity markets, all players are price takers, and that supply and demand adjust in response to prices, so pretty standard kind of situation. But that in industrial goods markets, the firms are actually price makers and pursue a cost-plus pricing on the way up, but prices are sticky on the way down. Also, the assumption is that quantity adjustments dominate in response to demand over price adjustments. If this is the setup, then there can be a situation where primary commodity price swings on the way up and on the way down can be negatively impacting growth. Based on this logic, then, the idea is that buffer stock stabilization can help create a win-win case for growth and development, especially if we think of commodity price producers as the global south and industrial goods producers as the global north. Keynes, as I mentioned, was in favor of an international buffer stock system that would have been married to his clearing union, where Bancor, the currency that would have been issued by the clearing union, would have been the currency that would have also been financing the buffer stock, and the buffer stock holdings would have been the asset that backs up Bancor. But it was not just Keynes, also John Boyd Orr, the first president of the Food and Agricultural Organization, was of the opinion that a World Food Board was needed as a global buffer stock system for food in order to stabilize food prices and overcome hunger. That, of course, did not materialize. Instead, we got a combination of somewhat protectionist foreign policy and price support policies for domestic producers in the global north, whereas the global south tended to continue to be at the mercy of commodity price fluctuations. In the 1970s, in the wake of the oil and grain price shocks, and of course also in response to OPEC, there was a new opening for the idea of international buffer stocks. In fact, in the Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, one of the key demands was the integrated commodity program, which was the idea of creating international buffer stocks, but there were also proposals for international food buffer stocks. I would argue that the window of opportunity for this policy has basically closed with the Volcker shock, which ended the interest in rich countries in these kind of stabilization schemes. And instead, we have seen a lost decade for development. We have seen a commodity slump in 1984 to 6 that brought commodity prices that were at the lowest level since the 1930s. And then, of course, we had the debt crisis in Latin America that was not least a function of the sharp increase in interest rates. And by and large, instead of a buffer stock facilitated kind of intensification of trade, which was the vision of the new international economic order, we got a period of free trade globalization. I would argue that we are living in a world of overlapping emergencies. I think we should all be happy that the current inflation bout is easing. Nevertheless, I think there are more shocks to come. And in particular, for the case of food, I think we have to think very seriously about buffer stocks. We have seen the FAO food price index shoot up in 2022 in the wake of the Russian attack on Ukraine. But it's important to note that actually there were no large shortages on the global market because the decrease in exports from Ukraine and Russia could by and large be compensated from other regions. With the shooting up of food prices, we have seen a shooting up of global hunger and an increase in food security, even in the richest countries of the world. And we have seen that the largest commodity traders, the largest food commodity traders, the so-called ABCD, that control between 70% and 90% of global food commodity trade, have reaped record profits, and as UNCTAD has pointed out, have actually been flourishing on volatility, not only on the way up, but also the way down. We have also seen unprecedented financial flows into food commodity trading on a scale that we hadn't seen before, which has also meant that the returns on these flows were unprecedented. So this is really a story of enormous price fluctuations that happens in an oligopolistic kind of market rather than the perfect competition setup of our standard COP model. Food price inflation was much higher in non-OECD countries than in OECD countries. And the contribution of food price inflation was much larger in non-OECD countries than in OECD countries. What we have seen is that even though the Food and Agriculture Organization food price index has been coming down, the food inflation rates have not come down with it. And in particular, in the least low-income countries, the food price inflation has been very high at a time when the global food price index was falling, which has to do with the exchange rate implications of the combination of import dependence for food and the capital flight that came in the wake of interest rate hikes in the US and Europe. So in this context, I have been arguing that we should revisit buffer stocks, and I've been proposing that we can basically reconsider the idea of multi-layered buffer stocks, where the idea is that you have an organization managed by some UN unit that has monitoring and commercial capacity for food staples such as rice, corn, wheat, and vegetable oils, engages in market operations both in physical and future markets, so virtual and physical buffer stocks, where financing can come, for example, through special drawing rights, windfall-profit taxes and bonds or currencies that could be issued against such stocks, as well as returns on buffer stock transactions if such a buffer stock buys when prices are low and sells when prices are high. So there should also be, I think, a greater support of domestic and regional buffer stocks by international development agencies, because buffer stocks are technically highly demanding kind of institutions and require a high degree of capacity. And finally, buffer stocks could be used as public procurement tool that can incentivize decarbonization and other transformative goals that one might have in the food sector. But the food sector is really just one example. I think that there is potentially scope for a return of buffer stock institutions and buffer stock logics in a range of critical commodities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Isabella. It's a pleasure to be here. I initially resisted this assignment because my knowledge of buffer stocks is so limited, but having given up my resistance, I discovered that it's a really very rich area with a very rich history, and I just learned so much from reading Isabella's paper and for thinking about the general topic. I also got super stimulated and wrote a much too long slide deck, so I'm going to skip over some slides, but it will all be posted. So the starting point for this paper is the idea that with COVID, with geopolitical tensions, we may be in a new world of sharp commodity price swings, which transmit macro instability, whether the moves are up or down, if they're big enough. And Isabella argues that standard monetary policies are ill-equipped to respond. And she proposes revisiting ideas which go back to the interwar period. There was Benjamin Graham, but also Keynes pushed these ideas very strongly. When we had the commodity shocks of the 70s and the new international economic order, the UNCTAD integrated program for commodities was launched. It never really got into orbit. And I learned from my colleague Morris Goldstein just on Friday, since I've been talking to everyone I see trying to get ideas about buffer stocks, that actually in the early 70s, the IMF had not only a compensatory financing facility, but a buffer stock financing facility, which the idea of both of these was to provide assistance to developing countries faced with shocks beyond their control. But the buffer stock facility was meant specifically to finance acquisitions of buffer stocks by developing countries. And Margaret Garretson de Vries discusses all of the work on this in her history of the IMF. The Caldor 1976 address to the Royal Economic Society is critical to Isabella's theoretical framework. She described it. And I won't say more about it, except to say that if you read to the end of the paper, it's clear that Caldor is very concerned not just with buffer stocks per se, but with the instability in the global economy following the end of the Bretton Woods system and the search for a new nominal anchor. And in part, his buffer stock proposal, which is very similar to Isabella's, issue SDRs to acquire buffer stocks and do operations in them to stabilize commodity prices, is very much a search for a new nominal anchor. So I found that totally fascinating. But I think we're in a different world than Caldor's, notwithstanding the return of very large commodity price shocks, which we also saw, by the way, in 2008, as Isabella pointed out, 2008 to 2011. Now, at the risk of revealing my age, I'll say that I was a student in Cambridge at King's College in the early 1970s. I had the privilege of hearing Lord Caldor speak. I can't say I knew Nicky Caldor, but this was an environment of macro chaos. I mean, I really cannot get it across to you what it was like. Everything was on strike. Every week there was a different strike, a bread strike, a coal strike. Trash collection was on strike. Inflation was high. Incomes policies were tried and failed. Internal deficits were huge. External deficits eventually brought the IMF in with a program for the UK. So this is the world in which Caldor was saying, commodity prices are out of control. They're causing social chaos. We need a new nominal anchor. What can we do? I would argue that we've actually done quite well in answering Caldor with modern monetary policy based on inflation targeting and independent central banks. If you look at this chart, it traces the sort of rise and fall of inflation in emerging and developing countries since 1980. And you do see a recent blip of inflation. You see the blip globally in 2008, just before the global financial crisis. But in fact, we've done pretty well on this. And the benefits have flowed broadly, but also specifically to the poor, as the Romers indicated in a Jackson Hole paper of 1998. The recent inflation spike has been quelled, largely, we hope, without a global recession. Now, past performance is no guarantee of future results, as they say. And we might think that in many respects, central bank independence may be under threat. But I would say this is impressive performance in terms of actually advancing economic knowledge and policy. Okay, well, some more on buffer stocks. We do have a lot of experience with specific commodities. And I think these experiences raise questions of the size of buffers, the cost, who pays for them, the governance of buffers, the lessons of earlier schemes. I think the role of speculators is a fascinating problem. Is it always destabilizing? If not, it may be that speculators actually play a valuable role in times of crisis, and that would disappear if we totally stabilize prices. I think extrapolative expectations can be a problem, but I also think that something that the recent finance literature mentions, which is limited balance sheet capacity, especially in crisis times, can be a problem. I think how we set target prices is a huge issue. Isabella showed the FAO real and nominal indices. Clearly, you can't have totally stable prices because market conditions change. The price you set determines the relative gains to importers and exporters are politically very salient. Isabella's underlying paper mentions the EU price supports, but at some level, setting a floor may be easier than setting a ceiling because the ceiling raises the Salon-Townsend problem of speculative attacks, unless we totally hobble the speculators, which we probably do not want to do. When we even talk about real commodity prices and think of those as a target, it raises the question of what do we use as a deflator to describe real, and that may be in the eye of the beholder. So that's an interesting question. If we look at the broader policy framework that's raised by these issues, I would argue that conventional monetary and fiscal policies, particularly monetary policy, has been pretty successful. Fiscal policy is subject to political dysfunction to an even greater degree everywhere and always. But these are necessary, if not always sufficient. And even when relative prices change, it's important to have a steady nominal anchor, the nominal anchor that Caldor wanted. And it's probably too much to hope that it comes from commodity stabilization schemes, in my opinion. In crises, however, and Isabella's theoretical and practical work has demonstrated this, there could be a role for unconventional methods, such as temporary price controls or subsidies if fiscal space allows. She has an interesting paper with Krebs pointing to the problem of multiple equilibria. If you have multiple equilibria, whether because of inflation expectations or speculative expectations, price controls where the government chooses the equilibrium can be useful in getting you a good equilibrium instead of a bad equilibrium. I would stress that market mechanism and price signals are generally going to be somewhat helpful, even in crises, and should be viewed as an asset and an aid to policymakers. A recent paper by Moll et al. In Brookings talks about the German experience in which price controls were useful, but clearly markets played a key role. But I would also urge you to read their political economy section if you have any doubts about the negative roles that industries can play in lobbying for their own self-interest, which I think to some extent can carry over to pricing behavior. Let me raise 3 problems with price controls aside from the standard allocation critiques. Inconsistent macro policies can lead to bad outcomes with price controls. So think of the US under Nixon in 1971-72, or the UK's 1970s income policies. Opportunistic price controls as political instruments are a problem. I'm going to go a little bit over my timer, if that's okay. Oh, 3 minutes. Ah, okay. I mean, my clock says 3:33, but that's the time, not how many minutes I have left. Opportunistic price controls. You know, what is the government's role? Can there be political factors at play? Certainly there can. And again, Nixon, 1971, 1972, used rate and price controls to manipulate the outcome of the election in the US. If price controls become a permanent part of the policy regime, how are expectations and market function affected? And this is basically a species of the Lucas critique. There is a role for international coordination, clearly, in any policy framework. The G20 helpfully created its global agricultural monitoring framework in 2011, and foreign policy initiatives can be important. The negotiation of Ukrainian wheat exports through the Bosporus, through the EU solidarity lines, and pressures internationally against export restrictions on foodstuff and fertilizer, where the WTO can play a role, and concessional loans. Let me make my last point, which is to make an analogy between the situation in agricultural markets and another aspect of monetary policy, which is apart from inflation targeting, which is the lender of last resort role. And here I know Cullen is going to make some similar remarks. But I want to stress the analogies with the financial sector. Now, clearly, international food security is a global public good, as Isabella stresses. I wonder if we should focus more on emergency reserves, such as the US Food Security Wheat Reserve, which can be targeted to the areas where most needed, even when there's no global shock. Clearly, these are the emergencies that where human suffering is immediately worst. And it may be that you can do a lot with something like this, which is much less ambitious than what Keynes or Graham or Kaldor or Isabella have suggested. There's a classical lender of last resort question, which is, do you lend to the market or do you lend to individual distressed institutions? And this is similar to the idea of, do we have a big fund which keeps market interest rates steady and which makes liquidity available to all? Or do you find where the problems are and go in more or less surgically? And the experience of the global financial crisis strongly suggests the latter, that what we saw is that individual institutions received support, but again, subject to an assessment that they were solvent, not insolvent, and had a liquidity problem. Solvency required other measures. But this also says that when you provide food support, you need to worry about the regimes, the nature of governance in the recipient countries. It does no good to provide food support if the government is going to go divert supplies and sell them on the market, and it never gets to the population. So there's a big role, even if you take this more limited view, for international cooperation, international surveillance, very much in the spirit of what Isabella has suggested. I'll stop.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Greetings from Denver, Colorado. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to offer some thoughts on Isabella's suite of proposals. And I'm going to be focusing specifically on those related to buffer stocks for food commodities. So cards on the table, I'm coming at this discussion actually as a political scientist whose work on food security is mostly focused on the impacts of food insecurity for political stability and the dynamic relationship between food insecurity and armed conflict. But I'm also very interested in the way that markets work or don't, as the case may be, to address the food security concerns of the world's most vulnerable populations. Many of those populations are living in deeply conflict-affected and fragile states. So my comments are going to be less about the economics of this proposal, but rather on the social and political impacts of what, if implemented, I think would constitute a very general and sweeping approach to addressing the problems of food insecurity and food price volatility, acknowledging that the goal here, I think, is to keep food markets in the Goldilocks range, not too hot, not too cold, and that there's a more general goal to which we should strive, which is to make good on the universal right to food. My first set of comments is about the relative impacts of using broad scope interventions, what I'm calling here shotgun interventions or approaches, versus more targeted, often means-tested interventions, what I'm referring to as scalpel-based approaches, to address problems like food insecurity and food price volatility. Secondarily, I'll touch on some of the more technical challenges of managing and stocking buffer stocks, right? So getting food into the system and then storing it and then getting it back out, especially with an eye towards trying to promote more equitable agricultural development moving forward. So again, here I'm making this distinction between broad scope or shotgun approaches to addressing price shocks and more targeted approaches, the scalpel, to address problems related to food insecurity and volatile prices. The proposal that's on the table here, so buffer stocks intervening to tamp down high prices or maintain a price floor when there's a glut in markets, is an example of the former, a shotgun approach on a global scale. What I mean by that is that it seeks to provide price stability for all consumers and all producers, regardless of their ability to pay or need. In this sense, it's analogous to a general consumption subsidy during high prices and a consumption tax during low prices. An example of a scalpel approach would be something more like SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program here in the United States. That's what used to be referred to as food stamps. So people meeting certain conditions, typically indexed to income, get targeted consumption subsidies or targeted price supports for particular producers when times are dire. Now, I don't think that we know much about what the effects would be at the global scale of this type of broad shotgun-based intervention, but we do know something about the effects of these types of interventions within economies, including the economies where these types of interventions on both ends would probably matter most for the outcome that we care about. So developing and middle-income countries, where there are large numbers of food insecure households and large numbers of food producers, many of whom are among the world's poorest and food insecure themselves. So let's start with efficiency, or simply comparing according to bang for the buck. Here, I think shotgun approaches fare pretty poorly. They either subsidize or tax the consumption and production of food for all, including people like myself, and I suspect most of the people tuning in right now who are fortunate enough not to necessarily need the help. In practice, the lion's share of benefits of these general kind of consumption subsidies, which is what I'm arguing the stock releases would amount to, are captured by those who are not in dire straits. And in advanced economies where the cost of grain itself is a relatively small share of the price consumers pay, I don't know that it would move the needle all that much if we also think that one of the ancillary goals of this type of policy would be to address the very difficult politics around inflation in the United States and other advanced economies. Similarly, they subsidize or tax production by all producers, or at least all those who produce stocked goods, including agribusiness titans, but also subsistence farmers. There would be knock-on effects for other food commodities due to substitution, I suspect. That's a little bit beyond my scope. In fact, I think it's important to keep in mind that the places that these types of policies would have the least effect are in fact in those pockets of the world like present-day Sudan or Gaza for that matter, where conflict is endemic, markets aren't functioning, and hunger is in fact most prevalent. This is where the pass-throughs from global markets are weakest. And I think that that matters because if the problem that we're trying to address here, at least in part, is acute food insecurity, we need to recognize that about 60% of the acutely food insecure live in a small number of countries and regions that are deeply conflict affected, where these types of interventions that are operating through the price mechanism are not likely to manifest themselves in better conditions on the ground. Next, we can think about the distributive consequences. So broadly speaking, interventions in markets to reduce prices, and I tend to think that the responses to food prices or food price increases and decreases would be asymmetric. I think that the trigger is likely to be pulled more frequently, or it is more probable to occur when prices are high than prices are low. The effect would be a transfer of benefits to consumers at the expense of producers. Now, I don't suspect many people in the room are going to necessarily cry for ADM or Cargill, which you heard about a little bit earlier, but in developing and middle-income countries, these types of policies tend to have real consequences for many rural households' incomes. We know from decades of history with these types of urban-biased policy interventions that the benefits tend to accrue to the better off in urban at the expense of the rural sector, which is one of the many reasons why agricultural innovation and yields have actually lagged in countries where policies are more urban biased. Now, in contrast here, a scalpel approach tends to affect a smaller number of poorer and more food insecure households in both sectors, though urban consumers often have advantages in gaining access to these kind of benefits just by virtue of being easier to reach. In terms of administrative burden, and I don't want to minimize the administrative burden and all of the questions that Maury raised earlier here, the benefits of buffer stock management and strategic stocking and release are more straightforward. They're just a lot simpler to implement than effective kind of means-targeted interventions. And that's not something that can be discounted and shouldn't be taken lightly. Finally, and this speaks to my own research, we need to be clear-headed about the implications for political stability. I recall that a lot of similar discussions were taking place in 2008 as the food price shock that occurred then led to protest and rioting in over 50 countries. For reasons that are related to these distributive consequences I outlined earlier, lower food prices tend to be good for maintaining stability in urban areas. But low food commodity prices tend to prolong existing armed conflicts, with the mechanism being decreased wages and poorer job and wage prospects for those in the rural sector relative to participation, relative to fighting, frankly. So for a variety of reasons, many, I think, governments would gladly accept this trade-off. Rural insurgencies rarely succeed in taking the capital, but urban protest movements can oust leaders and often quickly. And that's a big reason why urban bias exists in the first place, and it's typically larger in less democratic countries. So I think it's important for us to reflect on the trade-offs that are seemingly inherent in taking a broad aperture shotgun approach versus more targeted interventions for those who need them most. As Jason Furman reminded us last week at the Cooper Lecture, being clear-headed about trade-offs and cost, including opportunity costs, matters. Very briefly, my second set of points is a little bit more on the technical side, related to the logistics of sourcing and maintaining buffer stocks. The simple fact of the matter is that presently, the regions that would most need these stocks to guarantee food security and political stability are also those regions where spoilage rates are often quite high, sometimes as high as 50%. Now, that's food that is lost in the process of storing it due to rotting and spoilage. And it's important to remember that spoilage imposes a double cost. The food is never consumed, yet it consumes all of the ecosystem services and input costs associated with its production. This implies a large role for tech transfer and financing to modernize food storage systems in the LDCs in particular. Now, whether that funding would materialize and whether it would be considered funding for climate adaptation, which is certainly sorely needed, is an interesting question. And second, I'm a little bit concerned that restocking policies or stocking policies in the first place may increase inequality between large producers and smaller producers. Stockholders are human, and it's normal to expect that they will prize efficiency and the ability to make purchases in bulk, if for no other reason than, job one is making sure that the stocks are adequate and time and energy are finite. This is one reason why in places like India and China, smaller producers have often actively sought to forego selling on to national purchasing programs because the middlemen, pardon the gendered language here, are willing to pay the transportation and market costs. So taken together, I think that these two tendencies suggest to me that buffer stock policies will either need to sustain much higher transaction costs or risk widening inequality between larger producers who get the price stabilization benefit and smaller producers who may not. Lots to continue talking about, but I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cullen, Maury, and Isabella. A lot of food for thought. Ha, ha, ha. I actually want to start there. The discussion, for very good reasons, of human welfare and of economic impact started and seemed to mostly focus on food issues. But obviously in the background and in some of the pictures that Isabella evoked, and obviously when we're talking about inflation, we often think in terms of energy prices. And so I was wondering if maybe I could go sort of reverse order, starting with Cullen and end up with Isabella, and Maury can decide whether he wants to come in or not. But just say a few more words about, again, not too much detail, but just does this framework help with energy? How much does that depend on the path of carbon prices? How much is the political economy different or the same? Because obviously we've all got energy and climate in the back or even front of our minds, but it wasn't spelled out. So maybe Cullen, starting with you.
Sure, thank you, Adam. Just to kind of point out first, I guess, the obvious, which is that we do have an internationally coordinated buffer stock for conventional energy. This is essentially the founding rationale for the creation of the International Energy Agency was to coordinate the maintenance of, I think, 90-day stocks amongst the member countries, advanced economies at the time, in order to be able to use those kind of stocks both for domestic drawdowns in the case of supply disruption. This is very much an institution that is a creature of the 1970s and the supply shocks that occurred then, but then also has been used in response on a more unilateral basis or in a semi-coordinated basis among subsets of IEA members to address price spikes and then also local shortfalls in production related to natural disasters. I think that, I won't say too much about the political economy here because I may be the least qualified to comment on that, but I do think that it is somewhat different because if you'll recall in my remarks, I'm mostly focused on or a lot of my comments were motivated by the fact that when we talk about food, we're talking, of course, about major agricultural producers and advanced economies, but we're also talking about very poor people. To my knowledge, there are not a lot of artisanal oil producers. That maybe uncomplicates some of the equity concerns that I put on the table earlier, but it also suggests that you're opening the door to the vulnerability of these kind of stocking exercises to really significant geopolitical wrangling. Now, moving forward, I think that there's a fairly strong case to be made, both on national security grounds, but then economic security grounds for moving in the direction of a similar approach to stocking reserves for the minerals that are necessary for the energy transition. But I'll stop there for now and defer to my co-panelists.
Thank you. Isabella, on the energy front.
Yeah, thank you. Let me start with the political economy, since the German case came up and the example of lobbying came up. I think actually that the different constellation of interests when it comes to food and energy is one of the key reasons why we already have much more in energy than we have for food. And in fact, also why the interventions and the readiness to use unconventional measures in response to the energy price increases was coming forward more readily than in relationship to food. So that is just in terms of the political economy. I think that when it comes to energy, we have to think about the interrelationship between the fossil fuel prices and the need to transition to a decarbonized economy. In the European context, we of course have a European emissions trading system, which in fact at the peak of the energy crisis also saw peak carbon prices, which I think is one example where a carbon price regime that would be counter-cyclical to fossil fuel prices could be something that could be helpful. I also think that the mobilization of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was an important step, and in fact pretty unprecedented as far as I understand, and was done for good reasons, and that the stabilization of fossil fuel prices is something that can help rather than hinder a green transformation, because if we look at the profitability in the fossil fuel industry, then the energy price explosions in 2022 have brought record oil profits, oil and gas profits, to a point that a lot of the investments that should have been going into decarbonization have been withdrawn and have instead been going into the fossil fuel industry. So I think if we are serious about decarbonization, we can, in a sense, not afford these kind of profit explosions in a sector that we are trying to phase out, and that in this context, buffer stock stabilization on a more systematic scale than what already exists could be helpful. If I may, I just want to make one very quick comment on the comments. There is this question of whether price signals generally are helpful or not. I absolutely agree that price signals are generally helpful and very important. In fact, I think that buffer stocks operate through state market participation, which is a very different logic from actually going in and putting a price ceiling or price floor, because they could in principle also be operating on a discretionary basis. And in fact, the idea is that you use the market signals, you use the price signals that you get rather than suppressing them through some sort of direct price control.
Thank you very much. Maury, maybe I can sort of recast the question, and this also relates. After the last couple of years, you gave a resounding brief defense of sort of mainstream standard monetary policy. As we face climate change, as we face additional shocks potentially going forward and carbon prices moving in various directions, would you adapt the current inflation targeting framework in any ongoing way, or do you think we're okay with what we got?
Well, I think it demonstrated its value in the recent experience, for sure. But I think it's a mistake to think that monetary policy can do too much. It's a mistake because the simplicity of either a single target or a dual mandate, and the sort of transparency and political legitimacy that those endow on monetary policy are key assets for monetary policymakers. And if I look around the world at economic policy, I'm kind of astounded about the degree to which, in many countries, the adults in the room are the central bankers, and the pivot of economic stability is the central bank. So I wouldn't, you can always tinker around the edges, for example, the Fed's recent change in its monetary framework was an attempt to tinker around the edges, and what I think they succeeded in demonstrating is, if you tinker around the edges in a way that puts too much emphasis on recent experience, you may go seriously awry. So that having been said, clearly, once you recognize that monetary policy can't do everything, you have to ask what are the other things you want to do, and what are the tools that you can use. And there, to some degree, fiscal tools can be helpful. I think, as we discussed, in some contexts, administrative controls, quantity constraints can be useful. These are all subject to political constraints and political dysfunction. But I think that asking monetary policy to do more is difficult. And the one, I think the most major challenge to monetary policy that's emerged in the past couple of decades was the one revealed in the global financial crisis, that stabilizing inflation, getting price stability is necessary but not sufficient, and the financial sector is critically important. And the financial plumbing through which monetary policy is transmitted is critically important. And very often it's central banks also that have responsibility for those factors. So if I look for areas where more reform is needed, it's in thinking more deeply about financial regulation, what frameworks work, what frameworks are politically robust and not subject to dynamic consistency problems or to political meddling, because financial markets continue to evolve, and unfortunately they evolve in ways that counter whatever regulations the policymakers try to put in place.
Terrific, thank you. Our hardy in-person audience that made it through the rain, if you'd like to ask a question, please go to the mic. We'll collect 2 questions and then get replies, brief replies from our speakers, please.
Emeritus of Agriculture and Applied Economics at Virginia Tech. And I came here in person to hope to have an opportunity to inject into the discussion some discussion of the 60-year period in which we've moved away from government intervention in supply, in support prices, in stocks in the United States, and 30-year history of doing that in Europe. Hasn't happened yet in India, China, but if they follow the European and US experience as they become more wealthy countries, they will. So go back to the 1960s. We had support prices. We had huge stocks piling up. We had land set aside, tens of millions of acres of land set aside to keep the stocks from getting too big and to keep the cost of the support program from being too high. Farmers had to set aside land. So that just before the price spike in the early 1970s, we had like 30 million acres out of production because we thought prices would be too low if we brought it into production. Follow through to the 1980s, when we get the anti-inflationary deflation, agricultural support prices are too high, so prices are low. Support prices are lowered. Farmers are given income, cash payments instead. We get an export subsidy war with the European Union. You were
not invited here to be a speaker.
No, all right,
so come to a point or a question.
Let me just finish up.
No, I'm not going to let you finish up. Make a point or a question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask for the speakers how that history of movement away from stocks, how that history and why that's happened, how that fits into your proposal to go back to an era of much more intervention in stocks and price support and so on.
Thank you, Professor. Next question, please.
Yes, I'm John Bafesh from the World Bank, part of the unit that works on commodity markets. And I just wanted to say that throughout the history of the 20th century, there have been at least 40 international commodity agreements, most of which involved buffer stocks. So I was wondering whether you have looked at those and if you took into account the lessons that we have from those agreements. By the way, we did a study in the World Bank. We published it a couple of months ago, so I'll be happy to share that with you.
Thank you. Please do. And again, no disrespect to the professor. We're just trying to get in all the voices. So, Isabella.
Thank you very much. Would I also have a chance to respond to the comments to the presentation themselves? Maybe not.
No.
Okay. Okay. So I think, of course, it's a very long, very rich history, and I had 15 minutes to go through it all. So a lot has been condensed. I have, of course, looked at commodity agreements that were actually implemented. I would say that many of them collapsed when they were basically trying to target certain prices against long-run trends. What I'm arguing here is not trying to change the structural evolution of relative prices, but to take out some of the short-run volatility that I think is likely in the context of the massive instabilities that we are facing. So I think buffer stocks, I mean, putting it very short, like in a very simple way, I think buffer stocks fail when they try to change price trends. I think they can work when they try to take some of the extreme volatility out of the equation. So this is basically an emergency measure that is, however, based on preparedness and foresight rather than the kind of totally chaotic kind of responses that we have seen in recent years. I would say that what has happened in wealthy countries, for the most part, where price support policies trying to create a floor without a ceiling, which kind of by definition ends up creating milk seas and milk lakes and so on. So I think there the idea was, again, to basically structurally support prices in the long run, which is a different idea from trying to take out some of the extreme volatilities that I think are in the pipeline.
Thank you for making such a clear distinction. I'm afraid that's it for our time. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to reading the World Bank report referenced. But I also encourage you to read the full paper from Isabella and her co-author, and the slides and presentations from our three speakers today are available on PIIE.com. Thank you very much.